Chapter 17. All day Saturday the rain showed no sign of letting up. I cleaned as usual at the church, telling myself again that this was the last time. I missed Nathan more than ever and prayed that we'd soon be heading out of here, safer than we'd been in a long time. The day dragged, and I got more nervous. I made myself eat supper, though, and Artis and I cleaned the kitchen. She didn't say much, probably seeing how preoccupied I was. Brother and Mrs. Whitley sat in the family room, watching TV without much enthusiasm, both of them still dealing with an undercurrent of worry about Nathan. I didn't tell them where I was going. I knew they'd try to stop me on such an awful night, with roads impassable and more storms coming through. But I didn't want them to worry, so I wrote a casual note. "Gone to see Nathan at River House. Taking alternate route. Don't worry. I'll crash there tonight. Don't look for me till tomorrow." Then I slipped out the back door and went to the car. Nobody would even hear the engine, I didn't think, over the rush of the rain. My alternate route turned out to be a lot farther than it had looked on the map. I got to the interstate without running into any more flooding, but I had to go north all the way to Kirbyville to do it. Once I was heading south again, I started wondering if I should stop for more gas. I'd already used a quarter of a tank, and once Nathan was in the car, I didn't want to have to stop any sooner than I had to. He'd be madder than hopping hell, and might try to bolt if he hadn't cooled down. I drove as fast as I dared, desperate to have the worrisome part over and Nathan and me free and clear. At last I reached the exit and cut over to Highway 26. Praying that there would be no more flooding, I headed north up the dark road, peering through the rain even with the wipers at high speed. And then River House was closed and dark. I hadn't counted on that, Egan shutting down the bar because of the weather. I saw his triumph, though, and was relieved. At least they hadn't left. I parked in front and ran up the front steps. Through one of the windows I could see a light on somewhere, but the blinds were drawn. Carefully I pulled back the screen door and tried the wooden one. It was unlocked. I turned the knob and slipped quietly inside. Both Nathan and Egan were on stage, where the light was coming from. Nathan sat on the piano bench, holding his guitar, his head bowed. He was turned toward me, but gave no sign that he'd seen me come in. Egan stood over him, and the first thing I heard was his voice, low and hateful. "Don't you shut down on me," he told Nathan, through gritted teeth. "Don't you dare shut down on me, you little shit. You're no good to me that way, and you know it. You know it." Nathan didn't react. He seemed to radiate a sort of unearthly calm, as if it wasn't even him Egan was talking to. "So you sit up and finish the damn song. I don't care how you work it out. You just work it out." Nathan still didn't move. "Nathan!" Egan roared, and then Nathan did jerk a little, blinking and frowning slightly as if he'd just now heard Egan's voice. Slowly he turned toward the piano, like someone half asleep, and the light hid his face. Now he did look old and sick. His cheeks had hollowed out, and harsh lines etched either side of his mouth, which hung slightly open. His skin looked gray, his hair lifeless and stringy. Egan, watching him fiercely, didn't look much better. He wasn't healthy and glowing like before. His hair had dulled, and his face had more lines. Right away I had the impression, the sure flash of knowledge, that Nathan was withdrawing, a last act of self-preservation against Egan. He might not have realized it. In the functioning part of his mind he was still trying, but the rest of him was slowly shutting down. Then Egan looked up and saw me. "Well, well," he said, "look what the rain blew in." "Actually, the rain stopped," I told him, "but another line's coming through pretty soon." Which wasn't at all what I had intended to say, not that it mattered. Nathan acted as if he hadn't heard me or Egan speaking. His right hand came up and he played a few slow single notes on the piano, a sad and random sequence that made no musical sense. "What do you want?" Egan asked briskly. "We're working." Business as usual, as if I hadn't heard him bullying Nate when I'd first walked in. "I have to talk to Nathan. It's an emergency." "Oh, I'm sure," Egan snapped. Nathan kept staring at the piano keys as if he were in another world. His hand had dropped back onto his knee. I came closer to the stage. "Nathan, listen to me. Your father had a heart attack and they took him to Vanderbilt Hospital. You've got to come with me." About halfway through this, I'd heard Egan's scornful huff of laughter. Nathan sat motionless. Desperately, I stepped onto the stage and put my hand on his arm. "Nathan, you hear me? Your dad's sick. He needs you. He was asking for you." I shook his arm, which seemed to jolt him a little. He gave another of those waking up starts and slowly lifted his head to peer into my face. Lord, he looked terrible, squinting at me in that paranoid way, as if he were trying to see me through a fog. "Tim," he said. "Yeah, Nathan, your dad's in the hospital. You've got to come with me. I don't even know if he's still alive." "Dad?" "Don't listen to him, Nathan," Egan said. "He's lying." "He had a heart attack and they took him to Vanderbilt. Your mom sent me to come and get you, okay?" This was finally starting to penetrate. Nathan blinked at me a couple of times, and I could see a flicker of concern in his sunken eyes. Yeah," he said, but he made no move to get up. I took the guitar from his lap and set it on the floor. Egan started to laugh. "Tim, you are a piece of work," he said. "You really think you can get him back with bullshit like that?" "It's not bullshit. Nathan, come on." "He's lying, Nate. Trying to distract you, stop you." Nathan didn't look at either one of us, but he seemed distressed in a slow-motion kind of way. His eyes wandered sideways along the floorboards of the stage, and he was frowning. I couldn't believe how unresponsive he was. Of course I was lying, but he had no reason not to believe me. I'd been expecting him to panic and follow me straight out to the car. Maybe Egan had him on some kind of drug. But Egan was upset about his unresponsiveness too, judging from the way he'd been talking to Nate when I came in. No, Nathan had done this himself as a last-ditch protective measure against Egan's feeding. Except he still didn't understand at this point that it was Egan doing the feeding. He only knew something really bad was happening to him. He hadn't recognized where it was coming from. "Nathan!" I said desperately. Nathan raised his head and looked at me again, that peering through the fog look, and then he swung his head slowly toward Egan. "My dad," he said. "I have to go see him." "There's nothing the matter with your dad," Egan told him. "Call home. Call him up. You'll see." I didn't worry too much about that. Nathan didn't seem capable of remembering his phone number, much less dialing it. But his eyes came back to me uncertainly, wearily. "Tim's bullshitting you, man. He's lying, manipulating you, just to get you out of here. Some people will stoop to anything, I guess." "Are you?" Nathan asked me. "Are you putting me on?" I couldn't come right out and give him the blatant lie. I just couldn't. He'd always been so honest with me. I only looked back at him for a couple of seconds, and he said, "Why?" "Nathan, you've got to get out of here," I pleaded, but Egan's sharper voice drowned me out. "Because he wants to get you away from me is why. Old Tim knows you belong to me now." A faint hope rose in my chest. Maybe the riverman, that arrogant spirit that could never resist the urge to brag, was getting overconfident. "But it's too late for Tim to help." Egan shoved his hands into his pockets and smiled at us. "Too late for Tim, or for little Paige, or even Nathan's daddy. None of you can do anything about it anymore." His gleaming eyes flicked over Nathan pityingly, tenderly. "You're mine, Nate. You'll do what I say. Give me whatever I need." Slowly Nathan stood up, watching Egan. He swayed a little, but he managed to take a few steps, down off the stage and closer to me. "I don't belong to anybody," he said. "Try then," Egan invited him. "Just try walking out of here." They stared at each other for a few seconds, Egan's eyes light and silvery, Nathan's dark with exhaustion. Something was happening between them. Egan was doing some sort of pulling, sucking, and for some reason Nathan was open to it this time. I reached out to grab him just as his hands went to his throat and he dropped to his knees. "See what I can do to you?" Egan inquired. I knelt beside Nate and put my arms around him, pressing my head against his. His face had gone blank, his eyes at half-mast like a corpse's, and he sounded as if he were having trouble breathing. I talked feverishly into his ear. "Nathan, don't let him. He can't do it if you don't let him. So just be strong and stand back up and walk out of here, and he can't do a damn thing. Not if you don't let him." Finally, I felt Nathan draw a deep breath and stir a little as if to pull away from me. "Go ahead," Egan told him. "Walk right out." I looked around at him. Now he glowed against the room's shadows, his hair shining gold, his skin smooth, his whole body giving off a warm light, the light he'd pulled out of Nathan. I looked back at Nate. His face was still waxy pale, but there was a spark in his eyes, and I knew it was safe to draw back from him and stand up. "Come on," I said, holding out my hand. He took it and hauled himself up, still watching Egan as if he'd never really seen him before. "No, you don't need Tim," Egan told him softly. "You don't need anybody but me. You just need to not cross me is all. You just need to remember that." "I'll remember," Nathan said, his voice barely audible, his mouth sort of dry and clumsy. Then, slowly and shakily, he started moving, not toward the front door to come with me, but in the opposite direction. "Nathan, don't!" I ran after him and caught his arm. He stopped, but he didn't turn to look at me. "Let me go," he said. "No! Come on! Let's get out of here!" He didn't budge, except for turning his head toward me just enough so that I could see his mouth set in that obstinate way. "I know what I'm doing," he said. "Let me go." And all over again I had to remember it was Nathan's choice. I couldn't drag him. I had to let him go. My hand fell away from his arm, and my heart felt like a cold ball of clay as I watched his fumbling progress past the bar and through the doorway into the back hall. Egan watched him too, then turned back to me with a gentle smile. "I have to hand it to you," he said. "You gave it your best shot. It's people like you, in fact, that make things like this so goddamn much fun." "What are you gonna do with him?" "What do you mean?" "You've just about used him up. He's already not eating, not sleeping. You just gonna kill him off, or what?" "Oh, no," Egan said. "He won't die. He just has to change. He still wants his music out there, you know, to make people's hearts lift, tears come to their eyes, joy to the world, that kind of thing." He grinned at me until I wanted to kill him. What Nathan still has to learn, slowly and oh so painfully, he lingered lovingly on that word, is that the world doesn't give a fucking shit. Music goes out there and it dies and it doesn't change a thing. And when Nathan finally gets that through his head, then I'll be done with him. He laughed, raising one hand to flick a lock of that gilded hair over his shoulder. "The only bad part is, I don't have time to stick around for the rest of his life and watch. Watch him spread that pain around to everybody he can reach, like an animal with rabies." "You are a piece of shit under the heel of God," I told him. Egan only laughed again. "Oh, no, Tim, never that. Not when so many people let me suck the life out of them. Sort of like giving a spiritual blowjob, you know, except I'm the one that gets off." He glanced at his watch. "Listen, I'd love to stand here chatting with you, but I need to get upstairs to my protégé." Then he winked at me and started past the bar. I didn't waste time trying to think up something to say back to him. I turned in the other direction and went out the front door, trying not to hurry too visibly, because I had seen what Egan couldn't see, since he'd been facing the wrong way while he talked to me. I'd seen Nathan walk on through the hall, past the staircase, and straight out the back door of River House. Too much to hope that he had come around front to wait for me at the station wagon. I looked, of course, but the car was empty. So I ran to the back of the house and down through the yard. I didn't call because I didn't want Egan to hear. He'd be out here soon anyway, looking for Nate. Through the small forest that straggled to the river, I saw a pale flash that might have been Nathan's shirt. By now it had completely stopped raining. The trees still dripped all around me, and my jeans were soaked to my knees as I fought my way through the high grass down to the river bank, my feet catching in vines and roots along the slippery ground. The moon cast a little light when a leftover cloud hadn't slipped over it. I emerged from the trees onto the bank and stopped in horror. Green River had swelled to a terrifying height, only a foot or so below the bank. This wasn't the quiet jade river I'd seen all summer. Now it had an opaque, milky color because of the mud it carried. The water moved fast, its surface heaving with the force of runoff from the hills north of town, and its loud, rushing noise was almost a roar. Nathan stood precariously at the very edge of the river bank, holding onto an overhead tree branch as he watched me. I didn't get the impression he was about to throw himself in. It was just that he had gone as far as he could possibly go, until the river stopped him. I made my way toward him, close enough so I could talk to him without yelling over the rush of water. "Nathan, man, what are you doing down here? Come on back to the car with me. We'll go home." He looked at me from under his brows, his eyes shadows in the dubious moonlight, and I could see how strung out, how exhausted, how pitifully thin he was against the big trees and the swollen river. His hand, gripping the branch above his head, looked skeletal. "Come on, Nate." I held out my hand. "You heard how he was back there. He's no good. You need to get out of here." "He's what you said he was," Nathan said. "He sure is." "You bet he is. Come on now, get away from him." "I can't." "What do you mean you can't?" "I've gone too deep. I can't get back out." Nathan looked out at the terribly alive river as if that was what he meant. "I went the wrong direction after all," he said, so low I couldn't be sure of the words. "Nathan!" I said sharply. Egan had to be looking for him by now, and I was getting panicky. "Figure it out later. Right now you're coming with me. Let's go home." "I would just be pretending," he said. "Pretending? Pretending what?" "Pretending to be good." "You haven't done anything bad. And anyway, there's nothing so bad you can't be forgiven for it. Even I know that." Nathan looked toward me again, although I knew this time he didn't really see me. "But I can never make restitution," he said. "For what?" "For depending on Egan instead of on God," Nathan said, and that was when he slipped, or part of the bank actually washed away from under his feet. I'm not sure which it was. He went down sideways into the raging water. After a second of pure terror, I saw that he'd managed to grab a tree root with both hands. The powerful current dragged his whole body sideways as he clung there, and I knew he couldn't pull himself out. So I flung myself down flat on the bank and reached for his hands. I remember his white face looking up. I could see the oval of it in the moonlight, as I grabbed his forearms and felt him transfer his hands to my wrists. And I had him then, in the double grip trapeze artists use, and I felt so sure and strong, pulling him against the current, and I knew I could get him out. I yelled at him to hang on, and he was. He braced his feet against the bank underwater to fight the river dragging him, and he was going to make it. I knew he was. Then I heard Egan behind me, screaming in that Hitler voice, "Hold him! Hold him!" And Nathan let go of me, his hands turning lifeless and limp, and I couldn't hang on to him all by myself against such a current. The last thing I remember is Egan's howl of despair and the mud of the river bank against my face, and Nathan's hands slipping even through my desperate grip as the river swept him away.